Sometimes the mountains call to you in ways that make your heart ache with longing you can't explain. For 70 years, Silas Merrick had answered that call, walking the same trails his grandfather once walked, feeling connected to something deeper than words. His old dog Bramble was his only companion now, the two of them moving slowly through the Elderglen peaks like they had all the time in the world. Then one morning, Bramble stopped cold before a massive boulder and started barking. The stone was split down the middle, showing a dark opening. Inside, Silas found stone stairs going down into the earth. The walls had old carvings he'd never seen before. But what he discovered in that hidden chamber changed everything. There was a portrait carved in the rock that looked exactly like him. How could that be possible? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning that changed everything started like any other in Silas Merrick's carefully ordered world. He woke at dawn in his log cabin, nestled against the eastern slope of Elderglen Peak, the same cabin his father had built with his own hands back in 1952. The floorboards creaked their familiar greeting as his bare feet touched the worn pine planks. And through the single window facing the valley, golden light painted the distant ridges in shades of amber and rose. Bramble lifted his grizzled head from his blanket by the stone fireplace, tail giving a sleepy thump against the hearth. The old border collie had been Martha's dog first, a birthday gift Silas had given her 15 years ago when the silence between them had grown too heavy with unspoken grief. They'd lost their only son, David, in Afghanistan, and for months afterward, the cabin had felt more like a tomb than a home. Martha had suggested they get a dog, something to fill the quiet spaces where David's laughter used to echo. "Morning, old boy," Silas murmured, running his weathered fingers through the dog's black and white coat. Bramble was showing his age now, moving slower on the steep mountain trails, but his eyes still held the alert intelligence that had made him such a perfect companion for exploring these ancient peaks. Silas dressed in his usual uniform, thick wool socks, worn denim jeans with patches Martha had sewn over the knees, a flannel shirt that had seen more sunrises than most people, and his grandfather's leather boots that had walked these same trails for 3 generations of Merrick men. The boots were resoled twice now, but the leather had molded to his feet like a second skin, and he couldn't imagine wearing anything else on his morning walks. Coffee first. Always coffee. The ritual was sacred, unchanged, since Martha's passing 3 years ago. He ground the beans by hand, using the old mill she'd bought at a church sale, the metal handle turning with mechanical precision as the rich aroma filled the small kitchen. While the coffee brewed in the battered percolator on his wood-burning stove, he stepped onto the covered porch and breathed in the mountain air that had sustained his family for 70 years. The Merrick connection to these mountains ran deeper than most folks understood. His grandfather, Ezra Merrick, had arrived here in 1955 with nothing but a deed to 40 acres and a determination to live life on his own terms. Ezra had been a man of few words but strong convictions, someone who believed that the modern world was moving too fast and losing touch with the things that really mattered. He'd built the original cabin with hand tools and timber he'd cut himself, living through 2 brutal winters in a tent while he worked. Silas's father, Thomas, had inherited not just the land but the calling. He'd expanded the cabin, added the stone fireplace, and spent his life working as a hunting guide for city folks who wanted to experience the wilderness without really understanding it. Thomas had taught Silas to read the forest like other men read newspapers, how to tell a story from broken twigs, how to predict weather from the way birds moved, how to find water by listening to the whispers of the wind. Now it was just Silas, the last of the Merrick line, and he felt the weight of that responsibility every morning when he stepped out onto this porch. At 70, he had no children to pass the knowledge to, no one to carry on the tradition. David's death had ended that hope, and Martha's cancer had taken away any chance of starting over. Some mornings, the loneliness pressed against his chest like a physical weight. But the mountains always called him back to purpose. Bramble appeared at his side, nose twitching as he caught the scent of something interesting on the wind. The dog had an uncanny ability to sense Silas's moods, and this morning he seemed more alert than usual. Ears pricked forward toward the high country where the old mining trails wound between the peaks. "Feel like a longer walk today, boy?" Silas asked, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Your old bones up for the ridge trail?" Bramble's answer was a sharp bark and a sprint toward the woodshed where Silas kept his hiking gear. For an old dog, he could still move with surprising speed when adventure called. Silas packed light, a thermos of coffee, some jerky, a first aid kit, and the small digital camera Martha had given him the Christmas before she died. She'd wanted him to document their walks, to capture the changing seasons, and maybe put together a photo album of the places they loved. He'd taken hundreds of pictures over the past 3 years, but the album remained unmade. Another project waiting for motivation he couldn't quite summon. The ridge trail started behind the cabin and climbed steadily through stands of Douglas fir and ponderosa pine, following an old deer path that Thomas had marked with subtle blazes decades ago. Silas moved at a steady pace, his breathing even despite the altitude. 70 years of mountain living had given him the endurance of a man half his age, though he was careful not to push too hard. Pride was a luxury he couldn't afford out here alone. Bramble ranged ahead and behind, nose to the ground, following scent trails invisible to human senses. Occasionally, he'd disappear into the underbrush, only to reappear minutes later with his tongue, lolling in a satisfied grin. This was his element, and watching him work reminded Silas why Martha had fallen in love with the breed. Border collies were bred for thinking, for problem-solving, and Bramble had never met a challenge he couldn't figure out. The trail wound upward through familiar landmarks, the lightning-struck pine where Silas had proposed to Martha 42 years ago, the rocky outcrop where David had seen his first elk at age 7, the small clearing where they'd scattered Martha's ashes on a morning much like this one. Each place held memories that both comforted and stung, reminders of a life fully lived, but now mostly past. As they climbed higher, the forest changed. The trees grew smaller and more gnarled, shaped by wind and weather into sculptures of endurance. Granite outcroppings became more frequent, and the soil grew thin and rocky. This was old country, land that had been shaped by forces far older than human presence. And Silas always felt a sense of reverence when he reached these heights. They'd been walking for nearly 2 hours when Bramble suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. Silas almost walked into him, so abrupt was the halt. The dog stood rigid, every muscle tense, staring at something ahead that Silas couldn't immediately see. His hackles were raised, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. Not the warning growl he used for bears or mountain lions, but something different, something that spoke of confusion rather than threat. "What is it, boy?" Silas asked, following the dog's gaze. Ahead of them, perhaps 50 yards up the trail, stood a massive boulder unlike anything Silas had ever seen in these mountains. It was easily 10 feet tall and twice as wide, covered in a thick carpet of moss that spoke of incredible age. But what made it truly remarkable was the perfect split that ran down its center, as if some giant hand had cleaved it in two with surgical precision. The split wasn't natural. Silas could see that immediately. No frost or root pressure could create such a clean, straight line. And there was something else, something that made his skin prickle with an unfamiliar sensation. The boulder seemed to radiate a presence, as if it were watching them, rather than simply standing there. Bramble took a tentative step forward, then another, his growl deepening. He circled the base of the stone, nose working furiously, but stayed well clear of the dark opening between the split halves. Whatever he was smelling, it both fascinated and frightened him. Silas approached more slowly, his mountain-trained caution warring with curiosity. He'd walked this trail hundreds of times over the years, and this boulder had never been here before. That was impossible, of course. You didn't just move 10-ton rocks without heavy equipment, but he knew these mountains like his own backyard. And he was certain this stone was new. As he drew closer, he could see that the split revealed not just an opening, but something that made his breath catch in his throat. Carved into the stone walls of the narrow passage were symbols, not scratches or natural formations, but deliberate markings made by human hands. The symbols were unlike anything he'd ever seen, neither the simple blazes left by hunters and trappers, nor the petroglyphs sometimes found in the region. These were complex, sophisticated, and unmistakably ancient, but it was what lay beyond the symbols that made Silas's heart skip a beat. The passage opened into what appeared to be a natural chamber, and from where he stood, he could just make out the beginning of what looked like carved stone steps descending into darkness. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered more to himself than to Bramble. "What do you make of this, old boy?" Bramble had no answer except continued agitation. He paced back and forth in front of the opening, clearly wanting to investigate, but held back by some instinct Silas couldn't understand. In all their years together, he'd never seen the dog behave quite like this. Silas pulled out his small flashlight and aimed the beam into the passage. The carved steps were clearly visible now, descending at a gentle angle into what appeared to be a much larger chamber below. The stonework was precise, professional, created by someone who understood both engineering and artistry. This wasn't the rough work of miners or the utilitarian construction of early settlers. This was something far older and more sophisticated. Against every instinct developed over 7 decades of mountain wisdom, Silas Merrick stepped into the passage. The temperature dropped immediately, and the air carried a strange mineral scent that spoke of deep earth and ancient secrets. His footsteps echoed off the carved walls as he made his way down the stone steps, Bramble reluctantly following behind. The chamber opened before them like a cathedral carved from living rock. Silas's flashlight beam swept across walls, covered in intricate carvings, symbols that seemed to tell a story he couldn't begin to understand. The ceiling arched high overhead, supported by pillars that had been shaped from the natural stone formations. But it was the far wall that made him stop breathing altogether. There, carved in perfect detail from the granite itself, was a portrait of a man. Not just any man, but a face Silas knew as well as his own, because it was his own. Every line, every feature, every detail of his 70-year-old face had been captured in stone with impossible accuracy. The carving showed him exactly as he was now, complete with the scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident, and the slight asymmetry of his nose from a long-ago hunting mishap. Silas stared at his own face, carved in stone that had to be centuries old, and felt the solid foundation of his world begin to shift beneath his feet. The carved face stared back at Silas with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of centuries. Every detail was perfect, too perfect for comfort. The slight crow's feet at the corners of his eyes, the way his left ear sat just a fraction higher than his right. Even the small mole beneath his chin that Martha used to trace with her finger during quiet evenings by the fire. All of it captured in stone that his grandfather had probably walked past 1,000 times without knowing what lay hidden beneath. Silas stepped closer to the wall, his flashlight beam trembling slightly in his hand. The carving wasn't just a likeness, it was him, down to details that only someone who had studied his face for decades could have known. But that was impossible. This chamber felt ancient, untouched by human presence for generations, maybe centuries. The dust on the floor showed no footprints except his own and Bramble's paw prints behind him. "This can't be real," he whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the carved space. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were false comfort. The stone was real, the carving was real, and the face looking back at him was undeniably his own. Bramble whined from somewhere behind him, a sound of deep unease that cut through Silas's shock. He turned to see the dog pressed against the entrance, every instinct telling him to flee this place that defied explanation. But Silas couldn't leave, not yet, not until he understood what he was looking at. He moved the flashlight beam across the rest of the chamber, taking in details he'd missed in his initial shock. The walls were covered in carvings that seemed to tell a story, images of men and women in clothing that looked vaguely familiar, but wrong somehow, as if he were seeing his own culture filtered through an ancient lens. There were scenes of hunting, of families gathered around fires, of ceremonies he didn't recognize but felt drawn to in a way that made his chest tight with unnamed longing. And there were other faces, dozens of them, carved at regular intervals around the chamber walls. Men who shared his bone structure, his jawline, his deep-set eyes. They were different ages, different expressions, but the family resemblance was unmistakable. It was like looking at a gallery of Merrick men spanning generations, that should have existed long before any Merrick set foot in these mountains. One, carving near the center of the wall, showed a scene that made Silas's blood run cold. A man who looked like a younger version of himself stood before this very chamber, arms raised toward a sky carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Around him were others, people dressed in simple clothing that reminded him of old photographs from his grandfather's time. But the detail that stopped his breath was the small figure at the man's feet, a border collie that could have been Bramble's twin. Impossible, Silas breathed, but his denial felt hollow in the ancient air of the chamber. He stepped closer to this central carving, noting the incredible skill that had gone into its creation. This wasn't primitive art. This was the work of master craftsmen who understood not just stonework, but storytelling. Below the main scene, symbols had been carved in neat rows, like text in a language he couldn't read, but somehow felt he should understand. The markings seemed to pulse in his flashlight beam, and when he stared at them too long, he could swear they began to make sense. Not the individual symbols, but the meaning behind them. It was like trying to remember a dream that slipped away the moment he grasped for it. Bramble's whining grew more insistent, and when Silas looked back, he saw the dog backing toward the entrance, hackles raised and eyes wide with fear. Whatever this place was, Bramble wanted no part of it. His canine instincts were screaming warnings that Silas's human curiosity was determined to ignore. "Just a few more minutes, boy," Silas called softly. "I need to understand this." But as he turned back to the wall of carvings, something had changed. The carved face that bore his features seemed different somehow, not in any detail he could identify, but in the expression. Where before it had appeared stern and watchful, now it looked almost expectant, as if it were waiting for something. Silas shook his head, telling himself it was just the flickering shadows created by his trembling flashlight. Stone didn't change. Stone didn't watch. Stone certainly didn't express emotion. But as he stood there in the ancient chamber, surrounded by images of men who shared his blood but couldn't possibly be his ancestors, he felt the solid certainties of his world continuing to crumble. A sound echoed through the chamber, not from Bramble, but from somewhere deeper in the stone. It was barely audible, more felt than heard, like the mountain itself was sighing. Silas froze, listening intently, but the sound didn't repeat. Still, it left him with the unmistakable feeling that he wasn't alone down here, that something vast and patient was aware of his presence. He moved to another section of the wall, where the carvings seemed newer somehow, though still impossibly ancient. Here were scenes he didn't recognize, but that felt familiar anyway. Rituals involving fire and stone, gatherings of people who looked like they belonged to his bloodline. Ceremonies that spoke of connections between the living and something far older than human memory. One carving in particular drew his attention. It showed a man standing before what was clearly this chamber, but the chamber was different. Where now there were simple stone walls, the carving showed elaborate decorations, hanging cloths, braziers burning with carved flames. And the people gathered in the space weren't just observers. They were participants in something that looked like a ceremony of passing, of inheritance. At the center of this scene, the familiar figure held something in his raised hands. Silas couldn't make out the details, but it was clearly an object of significance, something being passed from one generation to the next. The carved flames around the scene seemed to dance in his flashlight beam, and for a moment He could almost smell wood smoke and hear the distant sound of voices raised in song. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. Silas turned slowly, sweeping his light around the chamber, but saw only his own footprints in the dust, and Bramble pressed against the entrance like a sentinel. Yet the sensation persisted, not threatening exactly, but intensely aware, as if the mountain itself was taking his measure, deciding whether he belonged here. "Who were you people?" he asked aloud, his voice echoing off the carved walls. "And why do you look like me?" The question hung in the ancient air, unanswered but somehow acknowledged. Silas had the strange feeling that the chamber was listening, that his words had been heard and filed away by something that had been waiting a very long time for someone like him to arrive. He moved to examine more of the carvings, but as he did, Bramble's whining escalated to an urgent bark. The dog was backing up the stone steps now, clearly wanting to leave this place far behind. His canine wisdom was probably better than Silas's human curiosity, but leaving felt impossible. This chamber held answers to questions he hadn't even known he was asking. Still, Bramble's distress was real, and after 70 years in these mountains, Silas had learned to trust animal instincts. He took one last long look at the carved face that mirrored his own, committing every detail to memory, then reluctantly followed his dog up the stone steps and back into the morning light. Outside the boulder, the normal world reasserted itself with almost painful intensity. The sun was warm on his face, birds sang in the trees, and a gentle breeze carried the familiar scents of pine and wildflowers. It was as if the past hour had been a dream, except for the trembling in his hands and the way Bramble pressed close against his legs, seeking comfort. Silas looked back at the split boulder, noting how perfectly it hid the entrance to the chamber below. From the outside, it looked like nothing more than an interesting geological formation, the kind of thing a hiker might notice in passing, but not investigate. Only someone who approached from exactly the right angle would see the passage between the split halves. And yet Bramble had found it, had led him directly to it, as if guided by some instinct older than training. The dog was calmer now in the sunlight, but he kept glancing back at the boulder with obvious unease. "What do you think, old boy?" Silas asked, kneeling to scratch behind Bramble's ears. "Should we tell someone about this?" But even as he asked the question, he knew the answer. Who would believe him? Who would understand what they'd found without thinking he was a crazy old man who'd spent too many years alone in the mountains? The carved portrait alone would be dismissed as coincidence or imagination, and he had no way to prove what he'd seen. No, this discovery would have to remain his secret, at least for now. He needed time to think, to try to understand what the carvings meant and why they existed. He needed to research his family history more carefully, to see if there were connections he'd missed or stories that had been forgotten over the generations. But as Silas and Bramble made their way back down the mountain trail, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The chamber existed, the carvings were real, and somewhere in those ancient symbols lay the key to understanding not just his family's past, but his own purpose in a story that was far from over. The walk back to the cabin passed in a haze of disbelief and mounting questions. Silas found himself stopping every few hundred yards, turning to look back toward the ridge, where the boulder waited in its ancient silence. Each time, Bramble would pause with him, ears pricked forward, as if he too could feel the pull of that impossible place. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun had climbed high enough to cast sharp shadows through the pine trees. Silas's coffee had long since grown cold in his thermos, but the thought of drinking anything seemed absurd when his mind was spinning with images of carved faces that shared his features. He needed answers, and the only place to start looking was in the collection of family papers and photographs that Martha had so carefully organized during her final years. "Stay close, boy," he told Bramble as they climbed the porch steps. The dog needed no encouragement. He seemed reluctant to let Silas out of his sight after their discovery in the chamber. inside the cabin. Silas went straight to the old cedar chest that sat beneath the front window. Martha had spent months during her illness organizing their family history, sorting through boxes of papers that had accumulated over 3 generations of Merrick men. She'd said it was important to preserve the stories, to make sure their history didn't die with them. At the time, Silas had thought it was just something to keep her busy during the long days of treatment. Now he wondered if she'd known something he didn't. The chest opened with the familiar scent of cedar and old paper. Inside, everything was neatly organized in manila folders with Martha's careful handwriting on the tabs. Ezra Merrick, 1920-1989. Thomas Merrick, 1945-2010. David Merrick, 1985-2007. And at the back, a folder marked Family History, Unknown Origins. Silas had never paid much attention to that last folder. The present had always seemed more important than the past, and mountain life demanded focus on immediate concerns like weather, wildlife, and the practical matters of survival. But now he pulled it out with hands that trembled slightly, remembering the carved faces in the chamber that seemed to span generations of his bloodline. The folder contained photocopies of documents Martha had requested from various historical societies and government offices. Birth certificates, immigration records, land deeds, and census data stretching back to the late 1800s. There were also several old photographs, some so faded they were barely recognizable, and a few handwritten letters in script so elaborate it was difficult to read. Silas spread the contents across the kitchen table and began to piece together a story he'd never bothered to learn. Ezra Merrick, his grandfather, hadn't been the first Merrick in these mountains, as family legend claimed. According to a land deed dated 1887, a man named Jeremiah Merrick had owned property in the same valley 68 years before Ezra arrived. The deed was signed in a firm hand that looked remarkably similar to Silas's own handwriting. Jeremiah, Silas murmured, testing the name. He'd never heard it mentioned in any family stories. Yet here was clear evidence that Merricks had been in this area much longer than anyone had known. Why had Ezra never mentioned an earlier family connection to the land? A photograph tucked behind the deed made his breath catch. It showed a man standing in front of what looked like a mining operation, with several other workers gathered around equipment Silas didn't recognize. The man in the center bore such a strong resemblance to the Merrick men that he had to be family, but it was the landscape behind him that made Silas's hands shake. The distinctive twin peaks in the background were unmistakable. This photograph had been taken somewhere very close to where Silas had found the chamber. He flipped the photograph over and found faded handwriting. J. Merrick and Crew, Elderglen Mine, 1889. Below that, in different ink, someone had added, last known operation before the incident. What incident? Silas asked aloud, but the photograph offered no answers. Bramble, who had been lying quietly by the fireplace, raised his head at the sound of his master's voice. The dog's expression was alert, almost as if he understood that important things were being discussed. Silas returned to the documents, searching for any mention of this mysterious incident. Most of the papers dealt with routine matters, property transfers, tax records, census information. But near the bottom of the pile, he found a newspaper clipping that had been carefully preserved between 2 pieces of cardboard. The headline read, Elderglen mining operation abandoned after unexplained events. The article was dated September 15, 1889, and the text was challenging to read due to the old-fashioned printing and faded ink. But as Silas worked through it slowly, a story emerged that made his skin crawl with recognition. According to the newspaper account, Jeremiah Merrick's mining operation had been proceeding normally when workers reported strange sounds coming from deep within the mountain. The sounds were described as unnatural voices and hollow singing that seemed to echo from chambers that shouldn't have existed. Several miners refused to continue working, claiming they had seen carved symbols in the tunnel walls that appeared and disappeared when they weren't looking directly at them. The final straw had come when Jeremiah himself reported finding a chamber filled with artifacts of unknown origin that seemed to tell the story of people who had lived in the mountains long before any recorded settlement. The newspaper's account was skeptical, suggesting that isolation and hard work had affected the miners' judgment, but it noted that the entire operation was abandoned within days of the discovery. The article concluded with a line that made Silas's blood run cold. Mr. Merrick was unavailable for further comment, having departed the area with the stated intention of protecting what should remain hidden. The mine entrance has been sealed, and the location is no longer accessible to curiosity seekers. Silas set the clipping down with trembling hands. Jeremiah Merrick had found the chamber in 1889, had seen the same carvings, the same impossible portraits, and instead of investigating further, he had sealed the mine and disappeared, leaving behind only cryptic warnings about protecting hidden things. But if the chamber had been sealed in 1889, how had Silas been able to access it today? The boulder above the entrance showed no signs of recent disturbance, no indication that it had been moved or manipulated. It was as if the mountain itself had decided to reveal its secrets again after more than a century of concealment. A sound from outside made both Silas and Bramble freeze. It was the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on the gravel path that led to the cabin. Silas glanced at the clock. Nearly noon, too early for any scheduled visitors, and too remote for casual hikers to wander by accident. He gathered the papers quickly, stuffing them back into the folder with uncharacteristic haste. Through the window, he could see a figure approaching up the path. A woman walking with the confident stride of someone familiar with mountain terrain. She was middle-aged, dressed in practical hiking clothes, and carried herself with an air of purpose that suggested this wasn't a social call. Bramble was already at the door, tail wagging tentatively. His reaction was curious rather than defensive, which told Silas that whoever this was, she posed no immediate threat. Still, the timing of her arrival seemed more than coincidental, coming so soon after his discovery in the chamber. The knock, when it came, was firm but polite. Silas opened the door to find a woman with graying brown hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She had the weathered look of someone who spent considerable time outdoors, and her hiking boots showed the kind of wear that came from serious mountain travel. "Mr. Merrick?" she asked, extending a hand. "My name is Dr. Sarah Chen. I'm an archaeologist with the State Historical Society. I was wondering if we could talk about your family's connection to this area. I believe you may have information that could help with some research I'm conducting." Silas shook her hand automatically, his mind racing. An archaeologist, arriving the same day, he discovered an ancient chamber filled with impossible carvings. The coincidence was too perfect to be accidental. "What kind of research?" he asked carefully. Dr. Chen's smile was warm, but her eyes remained sharp and assessing. "I'm investigating reports of pre-Columbian settlements in this region. Specifically, I'm trying to verify some historical accounts that suggest there may have been sophisticated indigenous cultures in these mountains much earlier than previously documented. Your family has been here longer than most, and I was hoping you might have access to records or stories that could shed some light on the area's hidden history." The phrase "hidden history" made Silas's chest tighten. He thought of the chamber below the boulder, of the carved faces that mirrored his own, of Jeremiah Merrick's mysterious departure after discovering something that should remain hidden. "I'm not sure I can help you," he said slowly. "We're just mountain folk. Not much for keeping detailed records." But even as he spoke, Dr. Chen's eyes had found the manila folder he'd hastily set on the table just inside the door. Her expression sharpened with professional interest. "Those look like historical documents," she observed. "Family papers can be incredibly valuable for understanding settlement patterns and cultural interactions. Would you mind if I took a look?" Silas felt trapped between curiosity and caution. Part of him desperately wanted to share what he'd discovered, to have someone with expertise help him understand the impossible things he'd seen. But Jeremiah Merrick's words echoed in his mind. Some things should remain hidden. And there was something about Dr. Chen's arrival, so perfectly timed and focused, that set off warning bells in his mountain-trained instincts. "Maybe some other time," he said finally. "I'm not really prepared for company today." Dr. Chen nodded graciously, but Silas could see disappointment flicker across her features. "Of course, I understand. But Mr. Merrick, if you do come across anything that might be relevant to historical settlement patterns in this area, artifacts, unusual stone formations, evidence of earlier inhabitants, I hope you'll consider reaching out. Some discoveries are too important to keep to ourselves." After she left, walking back down the path with the same confident stride, Silas stood in his doorway for a long time, watching until she disappeared around the bend. Bramble pressed against his legs, whining softly, and Silas realized that the dog had been unusually quiet during the entire encounter. "What do you think, boy?" he asked, scratching behind Bramble's ears. "Coincidence, or is someone else already looking for what we found?" But even as he asked the question, Silas knew the answer. Dr. Sarah Chen's arrival was no accident. Someone else knew about the chamber, about the secrets hidden in the mountain. And now Silas faced a choice that would determine not just his own future, but the fate of whatever ancient legacy he'd stumbled upon in the depths of Elderglen Peak. The rest of that afternoon passed in restless contemplation. Silas found himself walking from room to room in the cabin, unable to settle into any of his usual routines. The family papers lay spread across the kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle he didn't know how to solve, while outside the windows, the familiar mountains seemed to hold new secrets in every shadow. Dr. Chen's visit had unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Her timing was too perfect, her questions too specific, and her professional interest in pre-Columbian settlements too closely aligned with what he'd discovered in the chamber. But what troubled him most was the feeling that she'd been watching him carefully, evaluating his responses for signs of hidden knowledge. Bramble seemed to share his unease. The dog had been restless since the archaeologist's departure, moving from window to window as if keeping watch for unwelcome visitors. Every small sound from outside, the settling of the cabin's old timbers, the rustle of wind through pine needles, brought his head up in alert attention. As evening approached, Silas made a decision. He needed to return to the chamber, to study the carvings more carefully and search for clues that might explain the connection between his family and the ancient people who had created that hidden space. The family papers had given him names and dates, but they hadn't answered the fundamental question of why Merrick faces appeared carved in stone that predated any known settlement in the area. He waited until full darkness before preparing for the journey. If Dr. Chen or anyone else was monitoring his movements, a nighttime expedition would be harder to track. He packed a more powerful flashlight, fresh batteries, the digital camera Martha had given him, and a notebook for recording observations. Most importantly, he included a measuring tape and a piece of paper for making rubbings of the carved symbols. "You up for another adventure, boy?" he asked Bramble as he shouldered his pack. The dog's response was immediate, a sharp bark and a sprint toward the door. Whatever had frightened him about the chamber during their morning visit seemed to have been overcome by curiosity and loyalty to his master. The night air was crisp and clear, with a crescent moon providing just enough light to navigate the familiar trail without using his flashlight. Silas moved carefully but confidently, his feet finding the path by memory and decades of experience. Beside him, Bramble ranged ahead and behind, his pale coat visible in the moonlight as he scouted for any signs of other human presence. The boulder loomed out of the darkness like a sleeping giant, its split face creating a shadow deeper than the surrounding forest. Silas paused at the entrance, listening intently for any sounds that might indicate he wasn't alone. But the mountains were quiet, except for the distant call of an owl and the whisper of wind through the trees. Inside the passage, He switched on his flashlight and immediately felt the familiar drop in temperature. The carved symbols on the walls seemed more prominent in the artificial light, their intricate patterns casting complex shadows that made them appear to move and shift as he passed. Bramble followed close behind, his earlier reluctance replaced by what seemed like protective determination. The chamber opened before them exactly as it had that morning, but something felt different. The air seemed charged with expectation, and the carved faces on the walls appeared more lifelike in the steady beam of his powerful flashlight. Silas moved directly to the portrait that bore his features, studying it with the careful attention of someone trying to solve a mystery that might define the rest of his life. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Every line had been carved with precision and artistry that spoke of both technical skill and deep emotional investment. This wasn't just a portrait, it was a memorial, a testament to someone who had been important enough to warrant such elaborate commemoration. But the face was unquestionably his own, complete with details that should have been impossible for ancient craftsmen to know. Silas began taking photographs, documenting every angle and detail. The camera's flash illuminated the chamber in stark white light, revealing nuances in the carvings that his flashlight had missed. In some of the photos, he could see connections between different wall sections, as if the entire chamber told a single, complex story that spanned the carved surfaces. Moving to the central scene that had caught his attention earlier, he studied the figure who looked like a younger version of himself. The man was clearly conducting some kind of ceremony, his arms raised towards symbols that hurt to look at directly. Around him, the gathered people showed expressions of reverence and anticipation, as if they were witnessing something of tremendous significance. And there, at the ceremonial figure's feet, was the border collie that could have been Bramble's ancestor. The dog in the carving wore the same alert expression, the same intelligent eyes, even the same distinctive white blaze down the face that marked Bramble's lineage. The coincidence was impossible to dismiss as mere artistic license. Silas knelt beside the actual Bramble, comparing the living dog to his carved counterpart. "What's your story, old boy?" he whispered. "Did Martha choose you by accident, or was there something else drawing us together?" Bramble's only response was to press closer to Silas's side, as if sensing the weight of the questions being asked. But his presence was comforting, a reminder that whatever mysteries surrounded them, they faced them together. Working systematically around the chamber, Silas made rubbings of the symbol-covered text sections. The markings transferred clearly to paper, creating a record he could study later in better light. Some of the symbols seemed familiar in a way he couldn't explain, as if they triggered memories that weren't quite his own. Others remained completely alien, complex geometric patterns that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. Near the back of the chamber, in a section partially hidden by natural stone formations, he discovered something that made his heart race. A small alcove had been carved into the wall, and inside it sat what appeared to be an artifact, a stone tablet covered in the same mysterious symbols, but clearly meant to be portable. Unlike the wall carvings, this tablet showed signs of handling, its edges worn smooth by countless touches. Silas reached for the tablet, then hesitated. Taking artifacts from archaeological sites was both illegal and ethically questionable. But this wasn't an official archaeological site. As far as he knew, he was the only person who had entered this chamber since Jeremiah Merrick in 1889, and if Dr. Chen's visit was any indication, others were already searching for exactly this kind of evidence. The decision made itself. Silas carefully lifted the tablet from its alcove, noting its surprising weight and the way it seemed to warm under his touch. The symbols on its surface were deeper than those on the walls, carved with deliberate emphasis as if they contained particularly important information. He wrapped it carefully in a spare shirt from his pack, protecting it for the journey back to the cabin as he prepared to leave, taking a final set of photographs to document the chamber's condition. Something made him turn back toward the wall with his portrait. In the harsh light of the camera flash, he could have sworn the carved face had changed again, not in any detail he could identify, but in expression. Where before it had seemed watchful and expectant, now it looked almost satisfied, as if his decision to take the tablet had been exactly what it was waiting for. Getting fanciful in your old age, Silas told himself, but his voice lacked conviction. Nothing about this place followed normal rules, and after everything he'd seen, he was no longer certain what was possible and what wasn't. The journey back to the cabin passed without incident, but Silas found himself glancing over his shoulder repeatedly, feeling watched by eyes he couldn't see. Bramble seemed to share his unease, staying closer than usual and pausing occasionally to look back toward the hidden chamber. Inside the safety of his cabin, Silas unwrapped the stone tablet and set it on the kitchen table beside the family papers. The contrast was striking. Centuries of mundane records of births, deaths, and property transfers, next to an artifact that seemed to pulse with ancient significance. The symbols on the tablet were clearly related to those he'd photographed in the chamber, but they were arranged differently, almost like a key or translation guide. As he studied the markings by lamplight, Silas began to see patterns he'd missed in the chamber's overwhelming environment. Some symbols repeated in specific combinations, suggesting a structured language rather than random decorative elements. Others seemed to be pictographic, representing objects or concepts through stylized images that gradually became recognizable as he learned to see them properly. One symbol in particular drew his attention, a simple design that appeared frequently throughout the tablet's text. It showed what looked like a mountain with a tree growing from its peak, and beneath it a simplified representation of a dog or wolf. The combination appeared at regular intervals, almost like a signature or identifying mark. Silas compared this symbol to the family documents spread across the table, looking for any similar markings in the historical records. What he found made his hands shake with excitement and fear. In the corner of Jeremiah Merrick's original land deed, barely visible in faded ink, was a small mark that the official recorder had probably dismissed as decorative flourish. But it was unmistakably the same symbol, mountain, tree, and dog, drawn with the same proportions and style as the carvings in the chamber. The implications were staggering. Jeremiah hadn't just discovered the chamber by accident while mining. He'd been drawn there by knowledge passed down through generations of Merricks. Knowledge encoded in legal documents and family traditions that had been forgotten over time. And now, more than a century later, Silas had been led to the same discovery by the same combination of circumstance and inheritance. But if the pattern held true, if each generation produced someone who would eventually find their way to the chamber, then his own discovery was just the beginning of something much larger. The tablet wasn't just a record of the past, it was instructions for the future, a guide for the next person in the bloodline to take up whatever responsibility the ancient people had left behind. Outside the cabin windows, the mountains stood silent under the star-filled sky, keeping their secrets as they had for generations. But Silas knew that silence was deceptive. The chamber was waiting. The artifacts held their knowledge ready to be unlocked. And somewhere in the symbols covering the stone tablet lay the key to understanding his family's true legacy. The question now was whether he had the courage to unlock it. The next 3 days passed in a blur of obsessive research and growing unease. Silas barely left the cabin except to tend to basic necessities, spending his waking hours hunched over the kitchen table with the stone tablet, the family documents, and a growing collection of notebooks filled with his attempts to decode the ancient symbols. Bramble had become his constant companion in this endeavor, lying at his feet during the long hours of study, as if understanding the importance of the work. The dog's presence was comforting but also troubling. Every time Silas looked at him, he was reminded of the carved border collie in the chamber and the impossible suggestion that their partnership was part of some ancient pattern. The symbol translation was proving more challenging than he'd anticipated. While some pictographic elements were obvious, mountains, trees, water, fire, others seemed to represent abstract concepts that didn't translate easily into modern thinking. There were symbols that seemed to indicate time, but not linear time as he understood it. Others suggested relationships between people and places that went beyond simple ownership or residence. But gradually, patterns began to emerge. The mountain tree dog symbol appeared to be more than just a signature. It was a title or designation that carried specific responsibilities. And those responsibilities seemed to center around the role of guardian or keeper, someone entrusted with protecting knowledge and maintaining connections between the physical and spiritual worlds. On the fourth morning after his discovery, Silas woke to find Bramble standing at the cabin door, whining softly. The dog's body language was tense, alert to something outside that demanded immediate attention. When Silas opened the door, he saw fresh tire tracks in the gravel drive and boot prints leading around the side of the cabin toward the storage shed. Someone had been here during the night, exploring his property with the confident movement of people who knew he was inside, but didn't care about being detected. The realization sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the mountain air. His discovery was no longer secret, and whoever was interested in the chamber clearly had resources and determination. He followed the boot prints carefully, noting their size and pattern. Two people wearing hiking boots, but moving with the purposeful stride of professionals rather than casual visitors. They'd examined his shed, checked the windows of the cabin, and spent considerable time near the tree line where the trail to the ridge began. Most disturbing of all, they'd left clear signs of their presence, as if they wanted him to know they'd been there. Bramble followed the trail with obvious agitation, hackles raised and growling low in his throat. When they reached the spot where the intruder's tracks turned back toward the road, the dog barked once, sharply, then looked at Silas with an expression that clearly said they needed to leave this place. Back inside the cabin, Silas made a decision that went against every instinct developed over 70 years of mountain living. He couldn't stay here and wait for whoever was tracking him to make their next move. The tablet was too important, the chamber's secrets too significant to risk falling into the wrong hands. He needed to find someone he could trust, someone with the knowledge and resources to help him understand what he'd discovered. But first, he needed to protect the evidence. Working quickly, he photographed every page of the family documents, uploaded the images to Martha's old laptop, and stored copies on multiple flash drives. The stone tablet was more challenging. Its weight and fragility made it difficult to transport safely, but leaving it behind wasn't an option. He wrapped it carefully in layers of foam, padding from old electronics packaging, then secured it in a sturdy backpack. The most difficult decision involved the chamber itself. Should he try to seal it again, as Jeremiah had done in 1889? Or would that simply confirm to his pursuers that he'd found something worth hiding? In the end, he chose a middle path. He would leave the chamber accessible, but remove any obvious signs of recent visitation, hoping that casual exploration wouldn't reveal its full significance. The journey back to the ridge took longer than usual, as Silas moved carefully to avoid leaving clear tracks while carrying the additional weight of his documentation equipment. Bramble ranged ahead, alert for any signs of other human presence. But the mountains seemed empty of everything except natural wildlife. At the chamber, Silas worked methodically to remove traces of his previous visits. He carefully brushed away footprints in the dusty areas, repositioned small rocks that had been disturbed, and used a soft cloth to clean camera flash residue from the carved walls. The work felt like sacrilege. He was erasing evidence of his own connection to this place, but he knew it was necessary. Before leaving, he took one final set of photographs, focusing on details he might have missed during his earlier visits. In particular, he documented the alcove where he'd found the tablet, noting the way it had been positioned and the wear patterns that suggested centuries of careful placement and removal. Someone had been maintaining this site long after its original creators were gone, treating it as a living shrine rather than a historical artifact. As he worked, Silas became aware of a subtle change in the chamber's atmosphere. The air seemed lighter somehow, less charged with the expectant tension he'd felt during previous visits. It was as if removing the tablet had released some kind of pressure, allowing the ancient space to rest in a way it hadn't been able to do while holding its burden of hidden knowledge. The realization troubled him. If the tablet's presence had been maintaining some kind of balance in the chamber, what would happen now that it was gone? And what responsibilities came with being its new keeper? Outside the boulder, Silas paused to study the entrance one more time. From this angle, the split in the stone looked entirely natural, the kind of geological formation that might catch a geologist's interest, but wouldn't necessarily suggest human modification. Unless someone knew exactly what to look for, the chamber would remain hidden. But as he prepared to leave, movement in the tree line below caught his attention. A glint of reflected light, too regular and bright to be natural. Someone was watching the ridge through binoculars, and they were positioned exactly where they'd have a clear view of the boulder and its surrounding area. Silas froze, his mind racing through options. Retreat up the ridge would leave him exposed on open ground with no cover. Moving down toward the tree line would take him directly toward whoever was watching. His best choice was to stay low and work his way around the boulder's base, using the massive stone as a shield while he looked for an alternate route down the mountain. Bramble seemed to understand the danger without explanation. The dog dropped to a crouch beside Silas, following his master's lead as they moved carefully around the boulder's perimeter. From this position, Silas could see more of the valley below, and what he saw made his blood run cold. There were at least 3 people positioned at different points around the mountain's base, all with equipment that suggested professional surveillance rather than casual hiking. They had him surrounded, or at least positioned to track his movements, no matter which route he chose to leave the area. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They were watching the obvious trails, the established paths that most hikers would use to ascend and descend the ridge. Silas had spent 70 years exploring these mountains, and he knew routes that didn't appear on any map. Animal trails and creek beds that could provide concealment for someone who knew how to use them. Working slowly and carefully, he led Bramble away from the boulder along a narrow ledge that connected to an old deer trail. The path was treacherous, requiring careful foot placement and constant attention to loose rock, but it offered the advantage of natural camouflage from below. Anyone watching from the valley would see only undisturbed forest canopy. The descent took over an hour, moving at a pace that balanced speed with stealth. Several times, Silas heard voices or equipment sounds from the official trails, confirming that his pursuers were indeed conducting a coordinated search. But they were searching for a panicked amateur, not someone with decades of wilderness experience and intimate knowledge of the terrain. By the time they reached the valley floor, Silas had formulated a plan. He couldn't return to the cabin. It was almost certainly under surveillance, and his pursuers would be expecting him to come back for supplies or shelter. Instead, he would use his knowledge of the mountain's hidden places to stay mobile while he figured out who was after him and what they really wanted. There was an old hunting cabin about 5 miles east, built by Thomas in the 1970s and rarely used since his death. It was well hidden, stocked with basic supplies, and positioned where Silas could monitor approaches from multiple directions. More importantly, it had a cache of emergency communications equipment that might allow him to contact help without revealing his location. But first, he needed to understand exactly what he was dealing with. The stone tablet's weight reminded him constantly of the responsibility he'd accepted by taking it from the chamber. Whatever knowledge it contained, people were willing to go to considerable lengths to acquire it. And if Dr. Chen's visit had been the opening move in a larger operation, then Silas was already several steps behind in a game whose rules he didn't understand. As he and Bramble made their way through the forest toward the hidden cabin, staying off established trails and moving with the careful silence of experienced hunters. Silas found himself thinking about Jeremiah Merrick's decision to abandon his mining operation and disappear into obscurity. Had his great-great-grandfather faced similar pressures? Had he too been pursued by people who understood the chamber's significance better than he did? The comparison was both comforting and terrifying. Jeremiah had successfully protected the chamber's secrets for over a century, but he'd also chosen exile and anonymity as the price of that protection. Now Silas faced the same choice: safety through surrender, or danger through the determination to understand and preserve his family's ancient legacy. Behind them, the ridge rose against the afternoon sky, looking peaceful and ordinary from this distance. But Silas knew that appearance was deceptive. The chamber waited in its hidden sanctuary, empty now of its most precious artifact, but still holding secrets that people were willing to kill for. And somewhere in the weight of the stone tablet pressed against his back lay the key to understanding not just what those secrets were, but what he was supposed to do with them. The hunter had become the hunted. But Silas Merrick wasn't ready to surrender without understanding what he was fighting to protect. The hunting cabin materialized out of the forest shadows like a sanctuary conjured from memory. Thomas had built it in a natural depression surrounded by thick stands of pine and aspen, positioned where three small ridges converged to create a hidden valley invisible from any established trail. Even knowing its location, Silas had to search carefully for the camouflaged entrance that his father had designed to blend seamlessly with the surrounding deadfall. Inside, everything was exactly as Thomas had left it when he made his final hunting trip 8 years ago. Dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight that slanted through the single window, and the air carried the preserved scents of wood smoke, gun oil, and the particular mustiness of a place that breathed slowly through the seasons. But beneath these familiar smells, Silas detected something else, a subtle wrongness that made Bramble's hackles rise the moment they crossed the threshold. Someone had been here recently, not days or weeks ago, but within the past few hours. The disturbance was minimal. A displaced cobweb here, a slight smudge in the dust there, but to eyes trained by 70 years of reading forest sign, the evidence was unmistakable. Their pursuers had found this refuge as well. Silas moved quickly to the cache, hidden beneath loose floorboards in the cabin's northwest corner. The emergency supplies were untouched: dried food, medical kit, water purification tablets, and most importantly, a satellite communication device that Thomas had installed during his final years of guiding hunters in increasingly remote areas. But the equipment showed signs of recent examination, careful handling by someone who understood its purpose. "They know about this place," he whispered to Bramble, who was conducting his own investigation of the cabin's corners with obvious agitation. "They know about the family connections, the history, maybe even the chamber itself." The satellite communicator came to life with the soft beep of acquired signal. For a moment, Silas hesitated over the keypad, uncertain who he could trust with the knowledge he'd gained. Dr. Chen's perfectly timed arrival suggested that academic circles were already compromised. Local law enforcement would be out of their depth with something this complex and potentially dangerous. And involving federal agencies might bring exactly the kind of attention that Jeremiah Merrick had worked so hard to avoid. But as he stood in the violated sanctuary of his father's cabin, Silas realized he was thinking about the problem in the wrong way. He'd been assuming that his pursuers represented some kind of official interest, archaeological, academic, or governmental. What if they were something else entirely? What if the chamber's secrets had value beyond historical significance? The stone tablet seemed to grow heavier in his backpack as this possibility sank in. Treasure hunters, black market antiquities dealers, even corporate interests looking for exploitable resources. Any of these could explain the professional surveillance and the willingness to violate private property. And if his pursuers were motivated by profit rather than knowledge, they would be both more dangerous and less predictable than academic researchers. A sound from outside froze both man and dog in place. Footsteps, moving with the deliberate caution of people trying not to be heard. Multiple sets, approaching from different directions in a pattern that suggested coordinated movement. Bramble's lips pulled back in a silent snarl, his entire body tense with protective fury. Silas moved to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains his father had hung decades ago. 3 figures were visible through the trees, dressed in dark outdoor clothing and moving with the disciplined precision of professionals. They carried equipment that looked military rather than academic, communications gear, what appeared to be weapons, and detection devices he couldn't identify. This was no archaeological expedition. Whatever Dr. Chen represented, these people were something entirely different, a security team, perhaps, or private contractors hired to acquire the chamber's contents by whatever means necessary. The realization that he was dealing with people willing to use force changed everything about his situation. Moving as quietly as his 70-year-old joints allowed, Silas gathered the emergency supplies and stuffed them into his pack alongside the wrapped tablet. The cabin had served its purpose as a temporary refuge, but staying here any longer would mean certain capture. He needed to reach the deeper wilderness, places where technology and numbers counted for less than knowledge and experience. But first, he made a decision that went against every survival instinct. Using the satellite communicator, he composed a careful message to Martha's nephew in Denver, a park ranger who had the training to understand both the archaeological significance of his discovery and the practical danger he was facing. The message was deliberately cryptic, referring to grandfather's stories and family, artifacts in language that would make sense to someone who knew the Merrick history, but would seem like harmless family correspondence to casual interception. The response came within minutes, confirming that his message had been received and understood. Help was coming, but it would take time to reach these remote mountains. Until then, Silas was on his own with whatever knowledge and skill he could muster. As he prepared to leave the cabin through the back entrance Thomas had cut for emergencies, Silas took one last look around the small space. This had been his father's refuge, a place where Thomas had come to think and plan and connect with the wilderness that defined their family. Now it too was compromised, another piece of the Merrick legacy that had been touched by forces beyond their control. Outside, the forest seemed different than it had during his approach. Every shadow could hide watchers, every sound might signal pursuit. Bramble moved ahead with exaggerated caution, his natural herding instincts adapted to scouting for human rather than animal threats. The dog's behavior confirmed what Silas already suspected. They were being actively hunted by people who had both the equipment and the expertise to make capture likely. But the mountains were vast, and Silas knew hiding places that didn't appear on any map or satellite image. Natural caves, rock formations that created concealed shelters, areas where the terrain itself provided protection from both observation and pursuit. If he could reach the high country, he might be able to disappear long enough to understand what the tablet contained and how to use that knowledge. The climb toward the ridgeline was treacherous in gathering darkness, but Silas chose difficulty over concealment. His pursuers would expect him to take easier routes, to move like the elderly man they believed they were hunting. Instead, he pushed himself up slopes that challenged even his experienced mountain skills, using handholds and footholds that would be invisible to anyone unfamiliar with these specific rocks. Bramble followed with the agility of a dog half his age, driven by the same protective instincts that had guided border collies through generations of shepherding work. But as they climbed, Silas noticed something that made his chest tight with worry. The dog was showing signs of exhaustion that went beyond simple physical fatigue. His breathing was labored, his movements less fluid than usual, and his eyes held a weariness that suggested their adventure was taking a toll on his aging body. Just a little farther. "Old boy," Silas whispered during a brief rest on a narrow ledge. "Get us to the caves and we can both rest." But even as he spoke the words, Silas wondered if he was asking too much of his faithful companion. Bramble had already proven his courage and loyalty beyond any reasonable expectation. If continuing this flight put the dog at risk, was the tablet's knowledge worth that price? The answer came from the tablet itself, its weight a constant reminder of the responsibility he'd accepted when he removed it from the chamber. Whatever the ancient symbols contained, they represented knowledge that people had died to protect and preserve. Jeremiah Merrick had sacrificed his entire life to keep these secrets safe. Martha had organized the family papers as if she somehow knew they would be needed. Even Bramble's presence seemed part of a pattern that stretched back through generations. Above them, the ridgeline showed as a dark silhouette against stars that seemed unusually bright in the thin mountain air. Somewhere up there waited caves that had sheltered Merrick men for 3 generations, natural fortresses where Silas could make his stand while he worked to decode the tablet's message. And somewhere behind them, professional hunters were following, a trail that would lead them into country where technology mattered less than knowledge earned through a lifetime of mountain living. The game had changed from discovery to survival. But Silas Merrick was far from beaten. He carried 70 years of wilderness experience, the accumulated wisdom of 3 generations of mountain men, and most importantly, the determination to protect something that transcended his own safety. The ancient people who had carved the chamber had trusted their knowledge to his bloodline. He would not be the generation that failed that trust. As they resumed their climb toward the high caves, Bramble pressed close to his master's side, and together they disappeared into the mountain darkness like ghosts. Seeking sanctuary in stone, the cave system that had sheltered 3 generations of Merrick men opened before them like a mouth, carved from living rock, hidden behind a curtain of twisted juniper and lichen-covered stone. The entrance was invisible unless approached from precisely the right angle, knowledge that Thomas had passed to Silas during their final hunting trip together, along with warnings about using this refuge only in the most desperate circumstances. Inside, the cave extended far deeper than its modest entrance suggested, branching into multiple chambers that provided both shelter and concealment. Silas led Bramble to the largest chamber, where his grandfather Ezra had cached supplies during the harsh winter of 1962, and where his father had hidden from game wardens during a territorial dispute in the 1980s. Now, it would serve as his command post while he worked to understand the tablet's secrets. By flashlight, Silas arranged his supplies with the methodical care of someone who understood that preparation might mean the difference between survival and capture. The stone tablet he placed on a flat rock formation that served as a natural table, unwrapping it carefully and setting up Martha's camera to document his translation attempts. The familiar weight of the ancient artifact seemed to anchor him, providing focus amid the chaos of pursuit and discovery. But as he began his first systematic examination of the tablet in this new environment, something extraordinary happened. The symbols seemed to respond to the cave's atmosphere, becoming clearer and more defined in the artificial light. What had appeared to be random decorative elements in the cabin's electric lighting now revealed themselves as interconnected passages of text, telling a story that made Silas's hands shake as he began to comprehend its implications. The tablet wasn't just a record of ancient people who had once lived in these mountains. It was a genealogy, a carefully maintained record of bloodlines and inheritance that stretched back not decades, but centuries. And at its center, traced through generation after generation of symbolic representation, was the unmistakable lineage of the Merrick family. But the genealogy revealed something that challenged everything Silas had believed about his family's history. The Merrick line didn't begin with European settlement or immigration records. It stretched back to the original inhabitants of these mountains, the people who had built the chamber and carved the portraits. Jeremiah Merrick hadn't discovered the site by accident while mining. He had been drawn there by ancestral memory, by genetic inheritance that predated any written history. The implications were staggering. Silas wasn't just a descendant of European settlers who had claimed mountain land. He was the heir to an indigenous bloodline that had been guardians of this place for countless generations. The chamber wasn't a historical curiosity. It was his ancestral shrine, maintained by his people for his people, passed down through a line of guardians who had protected its secrets even as the world changed around them. The portraits in the chamber weren't mysterious coincidences. They were records of previous guardians, men and women who had accepted the responsibility of protecting knowledge that couldn't be allowed to fall into the wrong hands. And the portrait that bore his face hadn't been carved in the past. It had been carved in anticipation of his eventual arrival, created by people who understood that bloodlines carried both genetic and spiritual inheritance. As this understanding settled into his consciousness, other pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. Martha's careful organization of family papers hadn't been random. She had been preparing him for this moment, gathering the documentation he would need to understand his heritage. Bramble's presence wasn't coincidence either. The border collie bloodline had been bred specifically to serve as companions to the guardian line. Their intelligence and loyalty shaped by generations of selective breeding for this exact purpose. Even Dr. Chen's visit made sense now. She wasn't an archaeologist conducting random research. She was part of an organization that knew about the guardian tradition, people who had been watching the Merrick line for decades, waiting for the moment when the current guardian would emerge and claim his inheritance. But if Dr. Chen represented people who understood the tradition, who were the armed professionals now hunting him through the mountains? The answer came as Silas continued reading the tablet's genealogical record, tracing the complex relationships between guardian families and the forces that had always opposed them. Throughout history, there had been those who sought to exploit the Guardian's knowledge for personal gain. The ancient wisdom preserved in places like the chamber represented power, understanding of natural forces, connections to spiritual realms, knowledge that could be translated into control over others. And throughout history, each generation of Guardians had faced the choice between protecting that knowledge and surrendering it to those who would misuse it. The tablet revealed that this conflict hadn't ended with the arrival of European settlers. If anything, it had intensified as technology made the ancient knowledge more valuable and more vulnerable. The Guardians had been forced to go deeper underground, to hide their activities behind the facade of ordinary family life while maintaining their sacred responsibilities in secret. Jeremiah Merrick's abandonment of his mining operation hadn't been cowardice. It had been the traditional Guardian response to exposure. When the sacred sites were threatened, the Guardian line disappeared, taking their knowledge with them and waiting for safer times to emerge. But each disappearance made the next generation more vulnerable. As family traditions were lost and ancestral memories faded, now Silas faced the same choice that had confronted every guardian before him: preserve the knowledge by hiding it, or risk everything by trying to use it for its intended purpose. The tablet made clear that the chamber wasn't just a monument to the past. It was a working tool, a place where the ancient knowledge could be accessed and applied to contemporary problems. But using the chamber's power would require accepting his role as guardian completely, abandoning the comfortable fiction of being just an ordinary mountain man and embracing responsibilities that stretched far beyond his personal safety. It would mean trusting in traditions he'd never been taught, relying on instincts he'd never acknowledged, and risking not just his own life, but the continued existence of knowledge that had been preserved for countless generations. As he sat in the cave that had sheltered his ancestors, surrounded by the weight of mountains that had witnessed ceremonies and traditions older than recorded history, Silas felt the fundamental shift in his understanding of self and purpose. He wasn't just Silas Merrick, aging mountain man with a faithful dog and fading memories of a deceased wife. He was the latest in an unbroken line of guardians, inheritor of responsibilities that made his personal desires irrelevant. The sound of voices echoing from the cave entrance broke through his revelations like cold water. His pursuers had found the hiding place, probably through technology that could track the heat signatures of bodies in enclosed spaces. But they had made one crucial mistake. They were approaching the Guardian's sanctuary while the Guardian was finally awakening to his true nature. Silas looked at Bramble, seeing not just his beloved companion, but a partner bred for exactly this moment. Descended from dogs who had served guardians through generations of crisis and conflict. The border collie's eyes held intelligence that went beyond animal instinct. He understood what was happening, what was required, what ancient patterns were finally falling into place. Time to see what we're really made of. "Old boy," Silas whispered, his voice carrying a confidence that surprised him. For the first time since discovering the chamber, he wasn't running from something he didn't understand. He was preparing to defend something he finally comprehended. The tablet had given him more than genealogy and history. It had provided specific instructions for activating the chamber's true purpose, for calling upon power that had been waiting dormant for over a century. The knowledge was dangerous. Misused, it could cause damage far beyond anything his pursuers imagined. But used correctly, by someone with the proper bloodline and training, it could protect not just the Guardian, but everything the Guardians had sworn to preserve. Outside the cave, boots scraped against stone, as professional hunters prepared to capture what they thought was a frightened old man with a stolen artifact. They had no idea they were about to confront a Guardian who had finally claimed his inheritance, supported by traditions that predated their technology by millennia. Silas Merrick was done running. It was time to discover what the mountains had been waiting for him to become, the transformation that began with understanding the tablet's true message, deepened as Silas prepared for what felt like an inevitable confrontation. Knowledge that had seemed abstract and historical suddenly became practical and immediate. The symbols on the tablet weren't just records of the past. They were instructions for accessing power that had been dormant in these mountains for over a century, waiting for the right Guardian to claim it. Working by the dim light of his flashlight, Silas studied the activation sequences described in the ancient text. The process was complex, requiring precise timing and specific actions that would connect the chamber's carved symbols to the natural energy patterns that flowed through the mountain itself. But more than technical knowledge, it required absolute faith in traditions he'd never experienced and abilities he'd never tested. The voices outside grew closer, accompanied by the subtle sounds of equipment being deployed and positions being established. His pursuers weren't amateurs. They moved with the disciplined coordination of a professional team, probably with communications gear, night vision equipment, and weapons designed for close-quarters operations. In any conventional confrontation, a 70-year-old man and an aging dog would have no chance against such opposition. But this wouldn't be a conventional confrontation. The tablet made clear that Guardians throughout history had faced similar odds, protecting ancient knowledge against forces that possessed superior numbers and technology. What had allowed them to succeed wasn't physical strength or modern weapons, but their connection to power sources that their enemies couldn't understand or predict. Bramble seemed to sense the change in his master's demeanor. The dog's earlier anxiety had been replaced by alert readiness, as if genetic memories were awakening alongside Silas's growing understanding of his heritage. When Silas began gathering specific items mentioned in the tablet's instructions, stones of particular composition, water from the cave's natural spring, even soil from specific locations, Bramble helped with the focused intelligence of a working partner rather than a pet. The preparation ritual described in the tablet was both simple and profound. It required the Guardian to acknowledge his connection to the ancestral line, to accept responsibility for protecting knowledge that transcended individual survival, and to open himself to guidance from those who had walked this path before him. as Silas spoke the words inscribed in stone symbols, translating them into spoken language for the first time in over a century. He felt the weight of generations settling on his shoulders, but alongside that weight came strength, not just his own, but the accumulated determination of every guardian who had ever stood in defense of this sacred trust. The chamber below wasn't just a repository of historical artifacts. It was a focal point for power that connected the mountain to forces older than human civilization, energies that could be channeled by someone who understood their proper use. The tactical situation was becoming clearer as voices and equipment. Sounds provided information about his pursuers, positions and intentions. They had surrounded the cave system, but were proceeding carefully, suggesting they wanted to capture rather than kill. That gave Silas both an advantage and a responsibility. Whatever power he was preparing to access had to be used defensively rather than destructively. According to the tablet, the Guardian's primary obligation was protection of the knowledge, of the sacred sites, and of innocent people who might be affected by the conflict. The ancient power wasn't meant to be a weapon of conquest, but a shield against those who would exploit spiritual knowledge for material gain. This distinction would be crucial in the coming confrontation, determining not just tactics, but the fundamental nature of what Silas was becoming. As he completed the preparation ritual, marking specific symbols on the cave walls with materials gathered according to ancient instructions, Silas felt his connection to the mountain deepen in ways that defied rational explanation. The stone around him seemed alive, responding to his presence with subtle vibrations that spoke of recognition and acceptance. This was his place, prepared for him by ancestors he'd never known, but who had anticipated his eventual arrival. The tablet's final instructions dealt with the actual activation of the chamber's power system. This required returning to the carved chamber below the boulder, completing rituals that would awaken dormant energy patterns, and establishing a connection between the Guardian and the mountain's spiritual infrastructure. But doing so would mean leaving the cave's protection and venturing back into open terrain where his pursuers could intercept him. The irony wasn't lost on Silas. To claim the power he needed to defend himself, he would have to make himself more vulnerable than ever. But that paradox was itself part of the Guardian tradition. True protection came not from hiding, but from accepting one's role in the larger pattern, trusting that the mountain itself would provide support for those who served its deeper purposes. Outside, the sounds of his pursuers had grown more organized and purposeful. Tactical radios crackled with coded communications, and the deployment of equipment suggested they were preparing for a coordinated assault on the cave system. Time was running out for preparation. Soon, Silas would have to choose between surrender and commitment to a path that would change everything about who he was and how he understood his place in the world. Bramble moved to his side, pressing against his leg with the solid warmth of absolute loyalty. The dog's presence reminded Silas that he wasn't alone in this transformation. The border collie bloodline had been bred specifically to support guardians, their intelligence and instincts shaped by generations of selective breeding for this exact purpose. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, as their ancestors had done for centuries. The tablet contained one final revelation that crystallized Silas's understanding of the stakes involved. The ancient knowledge preserved in the chamber wasn't just historical curiosity. It contained practical information about natural forces that could be catastrophically dangerous if misused. His pursuers weren't just treasure hunters or black market dealers. They represented interests that would use the Guardian's knowledge to manipulate natural systems for profit, regardless of the environmental or spiritual consequences. This wasn't just about protecting family secrets or archaeological artifacts. It was about preventing the weaponization of wisdom that was meant to maintain balance between human needs and natural forces. The responsibility that came with Guardian status extended far beyond personal or family. Concerns, it encompassed the welfare of the entire region and everyone who lived within the mountain sphere of influence. With this understanding, Silas's last doubts about accepting his role disappeared. Whatever dangers came with claiming guardian status, they were nothing compared to the risks of allowing the ancient knowledge to fall into the wrong hands. The choice wasn't between safety and danger. It was between passive victimhood and active responsibility for protecting something larger than himself. He gathered the items required for the activation ritual, secured the tablet in his pack, and prepared for the journey back to the chamber. The route would be treacherous in darkness, made more dangerous by the need to avoid his pursuers' surveillance. But the tablet provided guidance for moving through the mountains in ways that traditional tracking couldn't follow. According to the ancient instructions, guardians who were properly connected to the mountain's energy could move through the landscape with a kind of natural camouflage, becoming part of the environmental pattern in ways that confused both human observation and technological detection. The ability sounded impossible to his rational mind, but everything about this situation had moved beyond rational explanation. As he prepared to leave the cave, Silas took one last look around the sanctuary that had sheltered 3 generations of his family. This might be the last time he entered this place as ordinary Silas Merrick, aging mountain man with a simple life and uncomplicated concerns. When he returned, if he returned, he would be something different. Someone whose responsibilities extended far beyond personal survival and comfort. Bramble waited at the cave entrance, alert and ready for whatever came next. The dog's confidence was reassuring, suggesting that the genetic memories awakening in both of them included knowledge of how to succeed at what they were attempting. The guardian tradition had survived for centuries because it worked. Because the connection between human consciousness and natural forces was real and could be accessed by those who understood the proper methods. Outside, the mountain waited in darkness, pierced only by the artificial lights of his pursuers' equipment. But beyond those temporary intrusions, older powers stirred in recognition of the Guardian's awakening, preparing to provide support for the defense of knowledge that belonged to the mountain itself rather than to any human authority. The final phase of Silas Merrick's transformation was about to begin, and with it, a confrontation that would determine not just his own fate, but the future of wisdom that had been preserved through countless generations of sacrifice and dedication. The time for preparation was over. The time for action had come. The journey from the cave to the chamber became something beyond ordinary travel. As Silas followed the tablet's instructions for moving through the mountain landscape, he found himself accessing knowledge that seemed to flow directly from the stone beneath his feet. The darkness that had seemed threatening now felt protective, and the terrain that should have been treacherous became familiar in ways that defied his 70 years of mountain experience. Bramble moved beside him with similar confidence, the dog's behavior suggesting that genetic memories were fully awakened now. They didn't follow traditional trails or use conventional navigation. Instead, they moved along paths that seemed to materialize as they walked, routes that felt ancient and purposeful, even though Silas had never seen them before. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit faded as their pursuers lost track of heat signatures that should have been easy to follow. The tactical radios grew frustrated, reporting impossible readings and equipment malfunctions that suggested their quarry had simply vanished from the mountainside. But Silas understood what was happening. The mountain itself was providing concealment, hiding the Guardian and his companion from those who would misuse the sacred knowledge. The approach to the boulder took half the time it should have, as if distance itself became fluid when traveled by someone properly connected to the land. When the massive stone formation appeared in the darkness ahead, Silas felt no surprise at finding it unguarded. His pursuers were still searching for him in places where ordinary people would hide, not understanding that guardians moved according to different rules. Inside the chamber, the carved walls seemed to pulse with anticipation. The ancient symbols were more visible now, glowing with a subtle light that had nothing to do with his flashlight beam. As Silas began the activation sequence described in the tablet, each step in the ritual felt both foreign and familiar, as if he were remembering rather than learning. The process started with precise placement of the materials he'd gathered, stones arranged according to cardinal directions, water from the cave spring poured in specific patterns, soil scattered to create connections between different carved sections. But the physical actions were only the beginning. The real activation required opening himself to the mountain's consciousness, accepting guidance from ancestors whose presence became increasingly tangible as the ritual progressed. Bramble positioned himself at the chamber's center, exactly where the carved dog appeared in the ancient scenes. The border collie's role wasn't passive. He served as a living anchor, his connection to the guardian bloodline helping to stabilize the energy patterns that were beginning to awaken throughout the carved space. As the ritual reached its climax, Silas felt the boundary between his individual consciousness and something vastly larger beginning to dissolve. The chamber filled with presence, not threatening but immense beyond human comprehension. This was the consciousness of the mountain itself, ancient beyond measure, patient beyond human understanding, but finally awakening to active participation in the world above. The carved portraits around the chamber walls seemed to move in the growing light, past guardians stepping forward to witness the activation of power that had lain dormant since Jeremiah's time. Silas could feel their support, their accumulated wisdom flowing into him as he became the focal point for energies that connected the spiritual and physical worlds. But with that power came immediate awareness of the danger approaching from outside. His pursuers had finally located the boulder, drawn by equipment that detected the energy emanations beginning to radiate from the awakened chamber. They were setting up positions around the entrance, preparing for an assault that would violate the sacred space with violence and greed. The mountain's response was immediate and decisive. The ground around the boulder began to shift, not violently but purposefully, creating obstacles that would channel the approaching team into patterns that served the Guardian's advantage. Trees that had stood for decades swayed without wind, their movements coordinated to block sightlines and disrupt communications. Even the air itself seemed to thicken, making movement difficult for those who approached with hostile intent. Through his connection to the mountain's consciousness, Silas could perceive his pursuers' positions and intentions with crystal clarity. Dr. Chen was among them, but she wasn't the leader. That role belonged to a man whose aura radiated the kind of focused ambition that would sacrifice anything for personal gain. They had come prepared for archaeological theft, not spiritual warfare, and their equipment was useless against forces they couldn't understand or detect. But the Guardian's power came with absolute restrictions. It could be used for protection and defense, but never for attack or conquest. The ancient wisdom that flowed through Silas made clear that any abuse of the mountain's energy would sever the connection permanently, leaving both Guardian and sacred sites vulnerable to future exploitation. This meant that the confrontation ahead would require finesse rather than force, strategy rather than overwhelming power. Silas had to find a way to neutralize the threat while preserving both the physical safety of his pursuers and the spiritual integrity of the Guardian tradition. It was a challenge that tested not just his newfound abilities, but his fundamental character as a man who had spent 70 years believing that most problems could be solved through honest work and straightforward action. The tablet provided guidance for this situation as well. Scenarios that previous Guardians had faced when forced to defend the sacred sites against those who would exploit them. The solution wasn't to drive away the intruders through fear or violence, but to demonstrate the true nature of the power they sought, showing them that it couldn't be stolen or controlled by those who lacked the proper spiritual preparation. As voices echoed from the chamber entrance, Silas began the final phase of the activation ritual. This would make the mountain's consciousness fully accessible to him, but it would also make him visible to his pursuers in ways that would force direct confrontation. There would be no more hiding, no more running. The Guardian's path led through the crisis, not around it. Bramble moved to his side as the chamber filled with light that seemed to emanate from the carved walls themselves. The border collie's presence was steadying, a reminder that he wasn't alone in facing whatever came next. Together, they had awakened something that had slept for over a century. Now they would discover whether they had the wisdom and strength to use it properly. The first intruder appeared at the chamber entrance just as the ancient light reached its full intensity. The man descended the stone steps with tactical precision, night vision equipment scanning for threats, weapon ready for immediate use. But nothing in his training had prepared him for what he encountered in the depths of the mountain. The chamber was alive with energy that made his equipment malfunction and his vision blur. Where he expected to find an elderly man hiding with stolen artifacts, he instead faced something that challenged his understanding of reality itself. Silas stood at the center of the carved space, surrounded by light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, while symbols that should have been static stone carvings moved and shifted like living text. "Stay back," Silas commanded, his voice carrying authority that came from the mountain itself. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," but the tactical team leader pushed forward, driven by professional pride and financial motivation that blinded him to the spiritual forces he was confronting. He raised his weapon, aiming at what he still perceived as just an old man who had taken something that didn't belong to him. The mountain's response was immediate and overwhelming. The chamber filled with sound, not audible noise, but vibrations that resonated through bone and consciousness, carrying the accumulated weight of centuries of Guardian tradition. The carved walls seemed to press closer, and the ancient symbols blazed with light that spoke directly to the deepest levels of human awareness. Dr. Chen appeared at the entrance behind the team leader, her face pale with recognition of what they had stumbled into. Unlike her companion, she understood the significance of what she was witnessing, not just an archaeological discovery, but an active spiritual site where ancient traditions still held power. "Johnson, stand down," she ordered, but her voice was lost in the chamber's overwhelming presence. The team leader's equipment was failing completely now, his night vision useless in light that seemed to exist beyond the normal spectrum. His communications dead in an environment that responded to consciousness rather than technology. Silas felt the mountain's consciousness flowing through him, offering power that could end this confrontation decisively. He could collapse the chamber entrance, trapping the intruders until they agreed to respect the sacred site. He could project fear so intense that they would flee and never return. He could even reach into their minds and erase their memories of ever finding this place. But each of these options violated the fundamental principles of Guardian tradition. The power existed to protect and preserve, not to control or dominate. Using it aggressively would corrupt both the energy source and the Guardian who misused it, breaking a connection that had been maintained for countless generations. Instead, Silas chose the path of demonstration and education. With Bramble at his side, he began to show the intruders what they were truly dealing with, not treasure or exploitable resources, but living wisdom that demanded respect and understanding rather than possession. The chamber's walls began to tell their story in light and movement, showing the long history of guardians who had protected this knowledge. The carved portraits came alive, revealing the faces of men and women who had sacrificed personal comfort and safety to preserve something larger than themselves. Dr. Chen watched in amazement as centuries of carefully maintained tradition unfolded before her, while the team leader struggled to comprehend forces that his worldview couldn't accommodate. But the most powerful demonstration came when Silas opened his connection to the mountain fully, allowing the intruders to feel directly what Guardian consciousness entailed. For a brief moment, Dr. Chen and even the hardened team leader experienced the weight of responsibility that came with protecting ancient wisdom. The constant awareness of balance between human needs and natural forces, the burden of knowledge that could heal or destroy, depending on how it was used. The experience was transformative, particularly for Dr. Chen, who had spent her career studying ancient cultures without truly understanding their living connection to the land. She saw now that the chamber wasn't just a historical site, but an active spiritual center where the boundary between past and present dissolved into continuous tradition. Johnson, the team leader, was less receptive to spiritual awakening, but even his materialistic focus couldn't ignore the practical implications of what he was witnessing. Whatever power source operated this place, it was beyond anything his employers could harness or control. Trying to exploit it would be like attempting to bottle a hurricane or chain a mountain to serve human purposes. As the demonstration reached its conclusion, Silas felt the mountain's consciousness beginning to withdraw, leaving him once again simply human, but permanently changed by the experience. The choice of how to proceed now lay with the intruders. They could acknowledge what they had witnessed and retreat with respect, or they could persist in their exploitation and face consequences that no human authority could prevent. The chamber fell silent except for the sound of breathing and the distant drip of water from natural springs. In that silence, the future of the Guardian, tradition and everyone present would be determined by decisions made in the next few minutes. Dr. Chen was the first to break the profound silence that followed the chamber's demonstration. She lowered her equipment with trembling hands, her scientific training warring with spiritual experience that challenged everything. She thought she knew about the relationship between human consciousness and natural forces. "I understand now," she said quietly, her voice carrying the humility of someone who had glimpsed something far larger than her previous assumptions. "This isn't a discovery to be catalogued or a resource to be exploited. This is a living tradition that we've interrupted." Johnson remained frozen in place, his weapon lowered, but his expression showing the confusion of someone whose worldview had been fundamentally shaken. The tactical advantages he understood, superior numbers, advanced equipment, professional training, had proven meaningless against forces that operated according to entirely different principles. Silas felt the mountain's consciousness settling back into its usual patient watchfulness, leaving him fully human again, but permanently changed by the connection he'd experienced. The Guardian abilities remained accessible, but they no longer flowed through him automatically. He would need to choose when and how to access that power, and each choice would carry the weight of responsibility for protecting wisdom that transcended individual concerns. "The chamber has shown you what it chose to show you," Silas said, his voice carrying the calm authority that came from understanding his role in the larger pattern. "Now you have to decide what you'll do with that knowledge." Dr. Chen stepped forward, careful to move with respect rather than aggressive purpose. "Mr. Merrick, I came here believing I was investigating historical artifacts. What I've experienced tonight changes everything about how I understand my work as an archaeologist. This site, this tradition, it needs protection, not excavation." But Johnson's response revealed the fundamental challenge that every generation of Guardians had faced. "Whatever parlor tricks you use down here, old man, they don't change the fact that you've taken property that doesn't belong to you. My employers want that tablet, and they're willing to pay significantly for its return." The confrontation that followed would determine not just the immediate fate of the chamber and its secrets, but the future of the Guardian tradition itself. Silas understood that force wouldn't resolve this situation. Violence would only attract more attention and bring additional threats to the sacred site. Instead, he chose the path that Guardians had used throughout history when faced with those who couldn't be educated or convinced. Working with the connection to mountain consciousness that remained available to him, Silas began a careful process of selective memory modification. Not erasure, that would violate the free will that the Guardian tradition was meant to protect, but adjustment. Shifting Johnson's recollections so that his search had led to empty caves and worthless stone formations rather than active spiritual sites. The process was delicate, requiring precise intervention that preserved Johnson's essential personality while removing the specific knowledge that made him dangerous to the chamber's security. Dr. Chen watched in fascination as the team leader's expression gradually shifted from hostile determination to confused frustration, his memory of the chamber's demonstration fading like a dream that couldn't be retained upon waking. "There's nothing here," Johnson said finally, holstering his weapon with obvious disappointment. "Just empty caves and rock formations. Waste of time and resources." He turned to Dr. Chen with irritation. "Your intelligence was faulty. We're pulling out." As Johnson and his remaining team members departed, their equipment mysteriously functional again once they moved away from the chamber's influence. Dr. Chen remained behind. Her memory of the spiritual demonstration remained intact, suggesting that the mountain itself had chosen to preserve her knowledge while protecting its secrets from those who would exploit them. "What happens now?" she asked Silas, as they stood in the ancient carved space that had become the center of his transformed understanding of purpose and responsibility. "Now I learn what being a guardian really means," Silas replied, his hand resting on Bramble's head as the border collie pressed close to his side. "This chamber, this knowledge, it's been waiting for over a century for someone to claim it properly. Jeremiah understood part of the responsibility, but he chose exile over engagement. I need to find a different path." Dr. Chen nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in her expression. "You'll need allies, people who can help protect this site while you learn to use your abilities properly. Academic institutions that study indigenous traditions, legal organizations that specialize in sacred site preservation. Maybe even government agencies that understand the difference between exploitation and protection." Over the following months, as winter settled into the Elderglen mountains and spring gradually returned, Silas began the complex process of learning to be a guardian in the modern world. The chamber became a place of regular pilgrimage, where he studied the carved instructions and practiced accessing the mountain's consciousness under controlled conditions. Bramble proved to be an invaluable partner in this learning process, his border collie intelligence adapting naturally to the requirements of guardian work. The dog seemed to understand instinctively when the ancient energies were active and when they should be left undisturbed, serving as both companion and spiritual anchor during Silas's explorations of inherited abilities. Dr. Chen became a crucial ally, using her academic credentials and professional connections to create a network of protection around the site. Official documentation established the area as culturally sensitive, while carefully selected researchers were allowed limited access under strict protocols that honored the Guardian tradition rather than threatening it. But perhaps the most important development was Silas's growing understanding that his role as Guardian extended beyond simply protecting the chamber and its artifacts. The ancient knowledge preserved in the carved symbols contained practical wisdom about maintaining balance between human activity and natural forces, information that became increasingly relevant as environmental pressures mounted throughout the region, working carefully and always with respect for the traditions he was still learning to understand. Silas began applying Guardian knowledge to contemporary problems. Drought conditions responded to rituals that encouraged natural water flow patterns. Wildlife populations found new stability through interventions that restored ancient migration routes. Even human communities in the valley below began to benefit from subtle adjustments that aligned their activities with the land's natural rhythms. The tablet that had started his journey became a daily reference, its symbols gradually revealing layers of meaning that went far beyond the genealogical records he'd first discovered. It contained practical instructions for everything from weather prediction to soil restoration. knowledge that indigenous peoples had developed through centuries of careful observation and spiritual connection to the land. On quiet evenings in his cabin, as Bramble dozed by the fireplace and the familiar sounds of the mountain night surrounded them, Silas often reflected on the extraordinary transformation his life had undergone. 6 months ago, he had been simply an aging mountain man with fading memories and a loyal dog. Now he was the active guardian of wisdom that connected him to both his ancestors and the land itself in ways that gave new meaning to every day. Martha would have understood, he realized. Her careful organization of family papers, her insistence on preserving stories and traditions. She had been preparing him for this role, even when neither of them understood what that preparation was for. And David, their lost son, lived on not just in memory, but in the continuing bloodline that carried guardian responsibilities into the future. The chamber remained active, its carved walls continuing to reveal new information as Silas's understanding deepened and his connection to the mountain consciousness grew stronger. Each visit brought fresh insights, new challenges, and deeper appreciation for the wisdom that previous generations had preserved at such personal cost. But most importantly, the guardian tradition lived on, no longer hidden and dormant, but actively engaged with the world it was meant to protect. The ancient compact between human consciousness and natural forces had been renewed, creating possibilities for balance and harmony that extended far beyond the borders of Elderglen Peak. As Silas stood on his cabin porch one morning, watching the sun rise over mountains that now felt like trusted partners rather than simply beautiful scenery, he understood that his journey was just beginning. The responsibilities of guardian work would last for the rest of his life, and beyond that, the tradition would need to find new carriers for the next generation. But for now, it was enough to know that the wisdom had been preserved, the connection maintained, and the sacred trust passed successfully from past to present. Bramble emerged from the cabin to join him in watching the dawn, and together they faced another day of learning to serve something larger than themselves in a world that desperately needed the ancient wisdom they were sworn to protect.